Cool. All right. Well, first of all, thanks to everybody for having us here, and thanks to JB and Alyssa and the Atlas Institute for putting this together. Yeah, so let's see. Well, we were all a bunch of Chicago tech folks, and one day I had received an email saying I was going to go to a local VC, venture capital firm, and give sort of a design 101 talk to a local startup, just to help them out. And so I showed up, and it was actually Michael Slaby pitching Harper, Dylan, myself, Scott Van de Plas, and Aaron Salmon, and a fellow named Connor Gaffney. And so pretty much everybody but Connor jumped on right away. Connor came a little bit later. But the pitch was pretty straightforward. It was the idea that the campaign is basically a volunteer-driven organization. We raised a lot of money, but the purpose of that money is to make sure voter contact happens, most often by neighbors and people, working within their communities. And we were going to use technology to make that happen a lot better. And so we ended up in that room because there were two folks. One, Rahm Emanuel, a bunch of us had worked on the transition site for him when he became mayor of Chicago. And then there was a fellow named Jason Rexilius, who I guess I can use his last name. He was a total Blackwater, right-wing person, really great guy, but totally different values than the rest of us. And so when we sort of had this recommendation come in from two different sides of the political spectrum as being people who were good at what we did, we ended up being in that room.
Yeah, why don't we pull those a little bit closer to you guys?
Yeah, I'm a low talker, sorry.
I have a much different story.
I was going to say, I was in that room, so you got my story.
Prior to the campaign, I was working for IBM as a software developer, and it was a good job. I liked it. Everything was going pretty well. And I got a direct message from Harper Reid, the CTO of the campaign. Got a direct message on Twitter, and all it said was, "Hey man, send me an email." And it was his email address. Now, I had never talked to him before. We had a lot of mutual friends, but I didn't really know him. So I sent him an email, and he said, we're looking for engineers. You want to come check it out? So I was already in Chicago at the time, so that meant just walking across downtown. And he gave me the pitch, showed me what they were doing, and I quit my job, and 2 weeks later I was working for the campaign. It was kind of hard to refuse. So.
Great. And I did want to reiterate the thanks to both the Atlas Institute and Silicon Flatirons for hosting us here. So thank you very much. And Jill and Alyssa in particular, thank you for all the work that you guys did in pulling this together. Great. So there's this infamous email that went out that was a recruiting email, which said basically, "This will suck if you come here." So talk a little bit about, how did folks communicate about what the cost of trying to do this was going to be, and then how, when you guys were recruiting going forward, did you communicate that to unsuspecting victims?
So there was the email that you're talking about was sort of a targeted recruiting email to people that were involved in technology, which hilariously did not work very well for us. Worked very well for a lot of other things that we did, but not in that case. But the theme in that email was a big part of how we interviewed prospective engineers, because when we brought a new engineer on, they went through 4 or 5 interviews with the CTO, the director of development, myself, and some number of engineers. And my job was to essentially impart some reality and remind everybody that this is going to be the worst job they've ever had. 18-hour days, 7 days a week, you're never going to see your family. It's going to be amazing, and it's going to be worth it. But, because if you're bringing someone on to do that for 6 months, a year, 18 months, if they don't know what they're getting into, they're going to be totally for it, and then 2 weeks in, they're like, this is not what I thought I was getting myself into. So, we tried to be as upfront as possible and balance that.
Yeah, and I think, first of all, we all took massive pay cuts to do it, but I think all those things are not the pitch, right? The pitch is, no matter what you do, and no matter where you work, you very rarely have a chance to impact history in the way that you could here. And so you pretty rapidly figured out whether you were talking to the right people or not, right? Within the first couple of interviews, if somebody was like, well, I don't know about this, it's like, yeah, I don't either. And it was pretty clear. You kind of,
One of the things that you guys mentioned to me was that it's counterintuitive, but that the engineering group the development group was actually older, actually more established and more mature than a lot of the rest of the campaign. Talk a little bit about that and kind of the culture of campaign versus engineering, because that's counterintuitive. Most startups aren't like that.
Sure. Yeah, so we can talk a little bit about sort of how it all came together. I think in some of the slides you'll see like some really empty offices, and then really rapidly it becomes a throng. So in reality, you've got people whose job it is to work on policy or communication, or work within the field organization itself. And so there's this sort of strange U-shaped dynamic both in the field and in the campaign itself. And what it is on the one side you've got folks 18 to maybe 29-ish. They've probably worked in politics their whole lives. Their career is just starting. They might have taken time away from high school or college to actually volunteer, and they've kind of gone on that path. And then you've got a lot of people who are basically career politicians, or they've worked in political apparatus their entire careers. So folks like Jim Messina or some campaign leadership. So we were sort of an outlier because we were basically folks from industry who came into a place that in some ways was really ready for us, and in some ways wasn't quite ready for us. But it all worked out, and yeah, that's kind of the deal. We ended up being super old. I'm the same age as Jim Messina, who's the campaign manager. I think our median age was around 25, and I'm far north of that. And I think that was pretty much the way of it with the tech team.
Yeah, sort of the technology was actually a relatively small group inside of this organization. The campaign organization consisted of a lot of volunteers and a lot of college-age people, because, frankly, they're the ones that care and have the time. So when we said the median age was 25, we were bringing that average up considerably. So there were a lot of young people, which was great.
We used to host a retrospective on Friday to talk about how the engineering team was doing, and we decided to invite the folks who did support for us to it, until we realized that meant that we could no longer serve alcohol at that meeting. So we gave them their own meeting.
So on the road up here, we were talking about how much we wouldn't talk about alcohol.
Yeah, there it is.
So there you go. But I will say that when I was talking to Jill about organizing this, I said, well, why don't we just have alcohol afterwards? She's like, it's at a university and the drinking age is 21. I'm like, oh, okay, never mind. Forget all that part. Let's flip a little bit from kind of the organization and all that. I do want to come back to that, but let's talk about when you guys came in initially, what did you think the problem was that you were trying to solve? And then I want to talk about whether, in retrospect, you feel like you solved it.
Gansen, I want to hear what you have to say, because you said that it was hard to refuse. So I'd love to know what problem you thought you were not refusing.
So when the job was pitched to me, I joined in September of 2011. So these guys started in April? May. So a few months before. So when I started, there was already a lot of stuff in flight. So the initial foundation for a lot of the technology products that the team was building was already starting to take shape, and they had actually shipped some code. It was obvious that there was some momentum going on, but when they were talking about what they wanted to accomplish by the end, by election day, there was a monumental gap between where they were and where they needed to be. And talking about the scale and size of what they were trying to build and the goals that they were trying to achieve, trying to bring on hundreds of thousands, if not millions of volunteers, hosting events and all sorts of stuff, trying to make everything work. It was really ambitious. And I looked at that and I thought, this is really cool. There's a lot of really interesting technical challenges. There's also just the uniqueness of being able to work on a presidential campaign. Those were the real motivators for me. In terms of the big picture problem, what our team was trying to solve, I think, Dylan, you're probably...
Yeah, so it was sort of a twofold problem, which was...
Just while you're doing it, that's the solution that you see scrolling along.
That's the finished
back.
product.
That's the finished architecture. It scrolls fast so we can get through it all.
It's kind of painful to look at. So that it used to all be in my head. So the goal was to build better tools to get volunteers to do their job better. That is fundamentally what we needed to do. In order to do that, we had to do a fairly massive refactoring and re-architecture of what had been in place and had been sort of the de facto standard for how campaigns run for the past X amount of years. So there's a slide.
You can't really call it. It wasn't perfectly greenfield development. Like there was a lot of stuff that already existed that our team inherited, but there was an incredible amount of flexibility to take processes that had been working but not well, and either
This is it, actually.
scrap it.
Yeah, that's the before. That's the and that's
And
the
that's
after.
the after. So that is how we viewed the re-architecting problem at the beginning, which was we had a bunch of different vendors. They had some ways of talking to each other, all of which were one-offs. So if you wanted to have a new way to communicate, let's say, events from one system to another, it meant brand new development and starting from scratch every single time. So what we envisioned was building an abstracted API layer that all of the vendors could talk to that, and we would be able to talk back to the other vendors and do all of the translation in-house so that we could move at the speed that we needed to do instead of having to wait for vendors to do it. So that was, with that, we could also expose that same API internally and build better tools faster. So that was the thing where once I saw that ugly picture of how it looked then, I was like, okay, this is the problem that I am going to tackle. And then I hired people to do it for me.
Found willing victims along the way. So just in terms of metrics, I mean, some of the things to share, they were up here on the screen, but the campaign ended up with 1,000 field offices, 10,000 neighborhood leaders within, or associated, I guess, with the field offices and sometimes not, 2 million shifts, so people actually working shifts at or out of a field office, 150 million phone calls, $690 million donated online, and then 200 applications, I guess, that were woven together in different ways to serve those various constituencies. So I know we talked about it on the way up, but the only question is, did you know that that was the scale when you walked in, right? And if not, why not?
Sure. And just to kind of go back to your previous question, because the two are kind of tied together, I think what I came there for, aside from cake and jokes, which were both good things, I showed up because the notion of what we were trying to do was build the Marshall Gans and the president's organizing style. In other words, snowflake style, community-based organizing, to be able to bridge that between what happens in a field office with what happens online and be able to tie communities together with
Could you
technology.
talk a little bit more about what that model is, what that snowflake model is?
Sure. So like one of these slides at some point you'll see there's like this notion of, okay, so I'll go way back to South Carolina in 2007. President's using traditional methods, which are basically you hire a bunch of people or you get some volunteers and you just sort of push them out en masse to make phone calls or knock on doors. And he's losing. He's losing to Hillary Clinton. And so they're like, wait a minute, why don't we go back to our roots and we'll try this sort of grassroots style of organizing known as Snowflake, which is you contact people who are community leaders and you say, hey, would you go out and reach out to your friends and host a meeting in your house and figure out how you can get involved. And so you start there, and what happens is that person becomes a neighborhood team leader. So those 10,000 people, they're volunteering 20 to 40 hours per week. So, I mean, hats off to them. They're the backbone of this organization. And what they do is they then have 4 people around them. So they have a data captain who's somebody to bang in all the data from people knocking on doors or making phone calls. There's a canvas captain who gets people organized to go out and knock on those doors. There's a phone bank captain whose job it is to make sure that those shifts are being filled and people are actually making calls. And then there's sort of a volunteer coordinator who's just a general wrangler for that place. And then in addition, there's all sorts of just different types of people doing different stuff, because in a field office, no matter what you do, it's valuable. So the comfort captain is the little old lady who comes in and brings brownies on Sundays, and you have all these types of roles, and you're trying to basically build that. And instead of displacing that, we're trying to augment that with tech in a way that connects them to the campaign at large, so that they're not just sort of going off on their own and doing their own thing, but instead they're connected to kind of the campaign as a whole.
That's great. And my perception is that historically, those connections were pretty ad hoc, right? I mean, there wasn't a technical connection between what was happening out there and whether it was data or anything more than data. And a lot of that not insubstantially because the vendors at the back end are vendors, and it's consultants rather than a team who are trying to tie that vent stuff.
Yeah, I think a lot of it's data, and a lot of it's even just stuff like getting information to people. So like there was the whole Big Bird hashtag going around. Well, what was that? Oh, well, Romney said in one of the debates that he wanted to kill PBS and kill Big Bird. Okay, so now you're going to go out, you're going to knock on a door, and somebody's going to say, what's this about Big Bird? And if you don't know, it's a lost opportunity. But if you do know, you can say, oh, well, the president believes that, public TV is an important part of educating kids, and you can have a conversation about what that means for them. And so you can take it to the next level and kind of bring them up the ladder of engagement. And without having that connection and that ability to get information to people, you see either people make it up on their own, and so this is how you get really crazy talking points from people, and it's, weird stuff showing up, or you just miss that opportunity.
Can you guys hear well enough? Do we need to speak up? Great.
All right. Are you looking at me? But you, Dylan, too. All right.
Yeah.
We'll get up
you can
there.
just shout out. Pretend like you're actually in, the campaign yelling at each other. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that dynamic. So you go from sort of 0 people 18 months before to however many, and then they all go away, right? Which is, one of the fastest growing startups, certainly measured by lots of ways, probably the fastest growing startups. But talk a little bit about, how do you do that? How do you recruit? How do you train? How do you onboard? How do you fire? Right? I mean, because there certainly would have been people along the way, right, that weren't going to work out. How do you do that? How do you figure that out? And then let's talk a little bit about some of the stresses involved as well. You might have been Dr. Fire. I'm not sure.
So in terms of firing is hard. It costs a lot of momentum. So we put a lot of energy into making sure that we are hiring the right people, because spending an extra week making sure that we found somebody that was good and was actually going to stay and was in it for all the same reasons that we were would pay off hugely instead of having to get a little bit out of them, ramp them up to where we need them to be, and then have them not work out. So we made some pretty clear decisions early on about how we were going to hire for technology, which was we almost exclusively hired senior people, which is part of how we got the age up. But
For the record, I'm not that old.
Yeah.
You just act like it.
Yeah, that's true. But we reached out deeply into our extended network, which is to say our own, which is the Chicago technology scene and the startup technology scene, and then also within the Barack Obama network, which is massive. We had a little bit of a head start versus a lot of startups, which is we have a great pitch, which is like, how would you like to work for the president? It's really hard to say no to that. So we had access to people, no matter who they were, no matter how great their job was, they would consider quitting their job for a year and a half because you don't get this opportunity all the time. So we had certainly head starts in terms of being able to hire the people that we wanted to. But that being said, we still, at the beginning, we hired a lot of people that we knew were incredibly smart, incredibly talented.
I'm just gonna jump in here. So that slide you just saw before, where there's 2 people and the little screen. So those were interns. Oh yeah, magic. Woo! So because I think this just kind of illustrates the point, right? These are interns, one of whom I think you said was from Facebook, one of whom's from Google.
Yep.
Right, and this is their conference room?
Yeah, so, we're starting to lose it. But yeah, so basically that beer pong table's a conference room, because conference rooms got taken. You couldn't use them anymore. That was a conference room, and that got taken. And then, this became a conference room. And so from our point of view, we're like, Winnie's from Google, Lear's from Facebook, and they're sitting there going, I can't believe we're sitting in a hallway, you know, facing a wall, and people are like, we can't believe you have a projector. Like, why are they coddling you people, you know? And so you're like, okay.
It's funny because I saw that out of the corner of my earlier today. I haven't seen that slide in a very long time, and I was like, why did they have a projector?
Okay, that. Yeah. But for folks like that, like, how would you bring them on board, right? How would they, you know, I get how the pitch would get them excited, but how would you onboard them? How would they know what to do? Right?
There were a lot of people that, I think, friends of Dylan and Harper and other people that would just be passing through Chicago and say, oh, I heard you're working on the campaign. Can I come by? Or they would reach out to him and say, hey, come check out what we're doing. And a lot of people would come, spend an hour, and then an hour would turn into a day, which would turn into a week. And eventually we'd have people that were quitting their jobs, or for whatever reason, they would just come volunteer with the campaign for months. And once people saw what was going on, what we were working on, they pretty quickly knew if it was for them or not. You walk into, so the office that we worked out of was in a high-rise in downtown Chicago. And it was pretty much an open floor on this high-rise. And you walk in, and the first thing you see is 400-odd people in this one huge room at these long rows of desks. And it's just absolute insanity, buzzing activity from about 9 in the morning till 9 at night, you know, give or take. And, you know, you've got a news camera and a live satellite link broadcasting from one corner. You've got TV blaring all the cable news network channels. On another corner, you've got people running around playing ping pong. You've got people sleeping at their desks. You've got people yelling into phones. It's just insanity. And some people look at that and say, you're crazy, you're out of your mind, I'm out of here. And other people that, for whatever personal deficiency, can't say no to that, like ourselves, say, yes, this is for me. And the kind of people that would attract generally turned out to be really, really awesome.
So, yeah, and kind of going back to talking about culture. I mean, so first of all, I think Dylan and Harper both did a really good job of rolling people on technically. I didn't have a whole lot of budget, so I ended up just recruiting volunteers like crazy. So I had Trammell volunteered for 6 months. We
And Trammell is the guy with the headdress.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, his Sylvester Stallone moment. He was a design researcher at Twitter, and I went and worked at a conference with him called UX for Good, and we're doing this conference, and I'm like, hey, I heard you might be leaving Twitter. You bored? You know? And so we did that total thing of he came in for a day became a week. He stayed at my house. My daughters charmed him. We found him better accommodations because he doesn't get up that early. And then, you know, it became a thing. And we did that with a lot of people. And mostly there's a thing in organizing called like story of self. So you tell your story of self, which is a challenge, a choice, and an outcome. So, you know, something happened to you in your life. You end up making a choice about that, and then you share, you know, what the result of that was. And so in organizing, you have a one-on-one where I share mine with you, you share yours with me, and we try to find what makes us a community. What is there that's common between the two of us? And so once you get to that, then you're telling the story of us. And then the next part is the story of now. This is that Marshall Gans format. And the story of now is what can we do to move our community forward? So one of the things I did was I just used that inside the campaign because everybody around you is an expert and they're great at something. You just have to figure out what it is. So even though you're super busy, your hair's on fire, you take 20 minutes and you say, hey, you want to grab a cup of coffee? And you have that conversation, and a month, a year, whatever later, it pays off. And a lot of it goes back to, like, there's the one slide, you know, our motto was respect, empower, include, win. And we all did our best to live up to that. And you're working with people from all over the country. So there was, you know, interns from Harvard and Yale showing up in Searsucker in July in an office full of 800 people that was like 75 degrees at 8 in the morning. And we're wearing shorts and beards and sweatshirts. And, you know, it's like, okay, we have to figure out what makes us have that commonality. And so basically, yeah, it goes from almost nobody in the room to about 800 people at summer of 2012. And then at that point, having people in the headquarters is kind of purposeless, right? Because where it's actually happening is out in the States. So you start seeing everybody leave. So we sent tons of people to Colorado, Pennsylvania, Florida, New York, or not New York, pardon me, New Mexico, and you start sending people back out and just helping out with what's going on in the field so that there's voter contact happening.
But to your point about, like, at the max we had, I think, 800 in a floor that was surely not zoned for 800. But to grow from 0 to 800 people in a year, which is about actually what it was, that's hard linearly. That's a lot of people to onboard. We had, in terms of just the mechanics of how it worked, there were people started on Mondays because there are too many people coming on for them to start every day. So people started on Mondays. There's orientation. We hired people that didn't know anything about campaigns for the most part. So after they got their general campaign orientation, they spent a half a day with us talking about what campaigns are, what the technology landscape of campaigns looks like, and where we're going. And then like 5 minutes about how we actually do technology. And so we got pretty good at that because we had to do it every week for X amount of weeks. And then when we got to 800 was actually the culmination of that, which was, I guess, May or June, whenever college gets out, we onboarded 150 interns in one day. And then this was the only time that we had 2 starting days. We had 150 on Monday and then another 150 on Tuesday, which, just pause for a moment and think about trying to find seating for 300 new people in 2 days.
Yeah, one of my survival tips would be write your name on your chair. It was very handy.
So yeah, let's talk about that. I mean, there's a lot of stress involved in the campaign. So just what were some of the worst moments? And I know, Jason, you've got a slide where you talk about how the feedback was coming back from the field for early iterations of the, right, there's a Linux programmer who's like got his head in his hand.
Yeah, we everything we did from a UX and product point of view was a first, which is like, that's, hey, we're blazing trails. It's very gratifying, except for when it totally is horrible and like doesn't work, right? And so a lot of what we did, you would do these things and you're like, you forget after a while. I've been doing work on .coms for like 20 years, and so early on you'd have to explain like why you do product work, why you'd talk to people who are going to use stuff to make sure it works for them. And so I'd kind of gotten used to the idea that you didn't have to do that, but then I came to the campaign and we totally did, because people weren't used to thinking of people who use stuff as anything. Like, they got their story and they got them as people, like as individuals, but they didn't get them as people who were actually had a seat at the table the same way that somebody in headquarters did. And so there's a lot of cultural stuff that went with that. When we first rolled out one of the products we worked on, Dashboard, we rolled it out in Iowa. They told people, like, this is the future. This is the way we're going to do organizing from now on. And one of the volunteers cried, which is a low moment when you make a user cry. Like, from a user experience point of view, it's a hint things are going badly. But we made it, and we got there, and we just kept at it. I mean, I think that's the main thing that leadership told us, and people tell you in general, is like, campaigns, you're going to spend your time in the barrel. After the first debate, everybody was convinced we were toast. When we all took our jobs, unemployment was super high, and people were also convinced that the president was not reelectable. And so you just kind of say, look, these are our values, and this is our strategy, and this is the way we're going to do things, and we're going to worry about the thing you can do today to move it forward. And we're going to do that today, and tomorrow we're going to do the same thing, and we're just going to keep on keeping on, and eventually it'll get better. And that's kind of what we did with user experience. We just kept running tests, and we kept talking to people, and we kept, we had weekly conference calls that anybody in the country who was using the system could hop on. And little by little, we started to respond to what people were doing, and we got successful. And that's basically how we did it.
Chris, what was the worst moment for you?
I think hands down the most difficult moment was in July when one of the staffers, Alex Okren, passed away. He died in the office. This is a guy, he's the same age as me. He worked on the field team, and he was just a regular Friday morning, and he collapsed at his desk and died at the hospital. And that was shocking, just because you you take so much for granted, and the campaign seems like such a well-oiled machine, and it moves with such momentum and force. Seeing it moving at full speed and then coming to an absolute dead stop, the office was absolutely silent. You don't know what it's like when you've been in this room with 400 odd people and it's just noisy, and then you walk in and you can hear a pin drop and everyone's looking completely devastated. That really put a lot of things in perspective. It was a very sobering moment. I don't think anything compares in terms of an emotional low from that. On the flip side, the emotional highs of the campaign are absolutely incredible, because you would stop working because they put up a live broadcast of CNN on the wall, and you'd have the president coming out in support for gay marriage, or the healthcare ruling was upheld. And at those moments, you feel so connected to the now of what's going on, because you have people running around, Dylan and the guys that are running the servers saying, "Oh my God, we got to scale up!" Like,
I was
there
going to
is a
say,
huge,
you stopped working?
there is a huge national event happening right now, and our organization is directly tied to it, if not the cause of it. And feeling so connected to that what's going on, and knowing that you are a part of this bigger organization that is working to make things better and has so much power. I don't think anything else compares to that. So those moments were definitely made the 60, 70, 8-hour weeks and constant screaming about how nothing was working. They made it worth it, or at least made it a lot easier to tolerate.
Yeah, so speaking of nothing working, Dylan, so you've got these 200 applications. You're going to put them all up on Amazon Web Services. They can't ever go down. You're going to have unparalleled scaling that you can't even predict, that you've got to deal with. What were some of the things that you guys did that made that actually end up not being a disaster, other than just luck?
Well, luck, I highly suggest having a lot of luck. That works great. But in addition to that, the big takeaway that we had was we were all very smart, and we did a lot of great things to make sure that we wrote all of our codes, that it was all of that stuff. But the thing that we actually learned the most from, I think, was making it fail. So we did a series of things that we called game days, where I told all of the engineers that we would set up our staging environment to be just like production, and they would come in on Sunday, and at 1 p.m. we would start, and here was the schedule, and we would turn off the database and see what works. And then we would turn off the API and see what works. And then we would choose other things and pretend to see what happens there. And everyone was sort of like, okay, yeah, that sounds great. And so we came in for the first day, and that was when they realized that I lied to them about all of it, which was like, yes, all of these things were going to happen, but we can't plan for things to happen in order. Like, disasters don't happen according to plan, so let's actually just break everything and see what happens.
Second most stressful day of the campaign.
Yeah. I apologize for that.
I'm still bitter.
I got great advice afterwards, which was make sure you buy pizza at the end, because that makes it better. So we did this, and it was one of the best learning experiences I've ever had, which was we learned how our applications actually failed, not how we thought they would, because we've done this a lot. We've built scalable architectures, and we thought that we knew how everything was going to fail over. And in some cases, we were very right. In a lot of cases, we were dead wrong. Like, for instance, almost everything that we worked with relied on our single sign-on identity provider. And so if that goes down, everything that we have goes down. all of a sudden there's $0 coming in. Zero. Like, that's not okay. So finding out ways to make sure that we should put some people working on making sure that that doesn't go down, and if it goes down in a way where the other things don't just die immediately. So we got some great information on how to move forward on making those things actually stay up in ways that are useful. The other great thing that came out of that, and Chris, you did the best of these, honestly, was a run book, which is, if you see this happening, this is probably what it is. Here's how you deal with it. So, like, yeah.
I wrote this document. I mean, it was probably 2 pages worth of instructions on how to react to issues, because I wrote it purely for selfish reasons, because I didn't want the site to crash and then have to be called at like 2 in the morning because somebody couldn't figure out how to get it back up. So I figured if I left detailed instructions on, if this happens, do this, or change this, or twiddle this, then it might come back up. That would keep me from getting that late night phone call.
So we did the first one of these, and we did it in our staging environment because we would be crazy to do it in production. Later on, it'd be great to do that, but we couldn't. So we did all that. We learned so much. We immediately applied a bunch of fixes to it, and it was great that we did that because literally the next day, Amazon died. So one small part of Amazon died for a short period of time, but we immediately knew exactly what it was because we had seen it yesterday. Everyone thought it was me being just a pain again, but it wasn't me. But everyone was like, this is exactly what we did yesterday. And it was like, yeah. And we were like, well, we know how to do this, so flip this switch and it redirects traffic over there and everybody's fine. Meanwhile, the rest of the internet was like down. So amazing timing. That goes back to that having luck part. So that was, yeah, I don't remember where I was going with that.
When we're building all these things, we keep the mantra, failure is not an option. Keeps getting drilled into our heads because we can't lose the election. Like, that is our single metric of success. Do we win or not? But we failed all the time getting to election day. We learned really quickly how to fail in terms of fixing bugs in our software. We wrote a lot of software that had a lot of bugs in it, and we fixed them all. And initially when we launched things like Dashboard and put it out in front of people, they click a link and it blow up and then, whatever.
And people would say, a true engineer.
People would say, "Oh, it's buggy. I'm never going to use this." And like, first impressions are tough, and you always want it to be perfect. But my background and all the guys I worked with, we come from these agile, iterative development styles where it's like, okay, let's just get something out the door. Let's get people using it. We'll improve it. We don't have to have everything perfect. So we end up working inside a huge organization that's really used to working with external vendors, working in a very classic waterfall model where you clearly identify all the requirements. We're going to write detailed specs. We're going to build something. We're going to hand it over, and people will use it regardless if it works or not. They're going to use it, and then that's how it is. Instead, we would do weekly releases and say, here's what we're working on. We would have fairly planned out roadmaps for features and when we're going to get things done, and just showing people inside the campaign that we can actually ship code that is imperfect, that has flaws, that doesn't work perfectly, but we're working on it. We're making it better every week. We're shipping. We're keeping ourselves accountable to what we say we're going to fix, what we're going to build, and all that stuff. Once we showed people that iterative development worked, then we were able to build all these tools and build in the protections against failure. And related to that, with the iterative stuff, we were testing everything that we built. So if things didn't perform, and we had metrics on almost every aspect of every system that we built, performance metrics, usage metrics, all sorts of stuff like that. We could tell who was clicking what, how fast things were working. If things weren't working, we knew, okay, we either need to optimize this, we need to make it work, if it's a mission critical piece of software. Or if it's kind of a frilly fluff piece, let's just kill it. There's no sense in keeping this around if it's not working, if it's buggy, if it's not worth fixing. let's just kill it and move on, because we have a whole laundry list of things that we could be spending our time on. And if we didn't do things in an iterative fashion, we would be shipping software that people use 20% of and the rest was just junk. And we were able to whittle it down towards the end where the features that we were giving people were what they needed.
So you guys had a bunch of interns, one of whom was Eric Schmidt, who's the chairman of Google. So how is it that he ends up being an intern? And how do you deal with folks like that in the campaign? What's the role, right? Because there were a ton of advisors like that around the campaign who were extraordinarily well respected. How did all that work?
I think he was an intern so that he got a badge. I think that's how that works. But he came around a couple of times, and he was incredibly helpful for several things. One is to sort of sanity check the direction that we're going with technology. He knows a thing or two about technology, it turns out. And that was incredibly helpful. The other part was making sure that our vision and our direction made sense to campaign leadership. While we were very trusted and given a lot of rope, as it were, within the campaign, having Eric Schmidt say, these guys are doing the right thing, is a very different conversation than having me say, trust me, dude, everything's going great. So that was incredibly helpful. And also just morale. He's a very dynamic person, and bringing him into a room full of engineers to review the work that they've done it's an experience that you can't really get elsewhere.
Third most stressful day of the campaign. I came in that morning, and then Harper, the CTO, came over and said, hey, dude, in a half hour, you need to present dashboard to Eric Schmidt. What? It actually went really well, but that was a difficult. And that's also that's a perfect case of like why campaigns are crazy. You never know who's going to be walking around. You have celebrities, you have news people walking around. You get emails from the press office saying, hide all of the beer bottles. There's a camera crew coming through. Hide all of your sensitive material. There's a photo coming through on the slides. We had a wall where we did a lot of our product planning. This is Jason's baby, his information radiator, as it was, which was a bunch of Post-it notes on the wall that were just high-level descriptions of all the features that we were building. And, to us, it's not that much, but to a camera crew, the first thing they're going to do is swing their HD cameras over there and, have that on CNN for 30 minutes or 30 seconds. So we'd have to put up these huge pieces of butcher paper to cover it up. That's not something that you do at a normal office.
And just to make them angry, I wrote on the butcher paper, top secret stuff behind this paper, which really, letter of the law. Eric was great, and he was great because he came back. There's a slide in there about Tufty. So Ed Tufty came in, and when we first started the campaign, gave us balsamic licenses, and it's a prototyping tool that uses some kind of ugly conventions. And Ed Tufty is a master of information visualization. He pretty much created the discipline. And so I had to present him some stuff, and he flipped out. Like, he's convinced we were making things intentionally ugly, designing for children. Basically.
The Comic Sans that did you in, right?
But yeah, Comic Sans and I were not friends after that. And it was one of those moments where, I think what the team got out of it was that I could take a beating and keep on working. But you had people come in and do this all the time, where they were experts at whatever. They came in, they talked, and they told you their perspective. I'd get all these design folks saying, I'll do design strategy for the campaign in a weekend. It's like, that's great. It's really not helpful. Because you don't know what's happening, And with Eric, it was cool because he came back on a regular basis, and he saw it sort of evolve, and he was really involved in 08, so he had perspective, and it was really, really helpful to have him there.
Yeah, he came by about a month before E-Day to review the technology disaster plans, which was again, amazing because it was just shortly after we had done that game day. Luck. And so we presented everything, and he was like, well, you guys have everything in hand. This is great. Which led to my favorite Eric Schmidt story, which is on election day. I sat in one chair just monitoring all of the systems and talking to people. And at 6 in the morning, Eric Schmidt walks into the office and he says, Dylan, what do you need from me today? And I was like, first of all, okay, go on. And I said, Eric, I need you to come by every hour and lavish me with praise. And he did. So it was great. And so long as nothing failed, that is, it was great.
So if you'd learned that lesson like 18 months prior, then every hour you'd be walking into Chris and saying, hey,
That's right.
praise, instead of
Not-
don't
not
fuck
too
up on
late
the
to
cake.
start.
Great. Let me take a little break here. Yes? Wait, I'm holding the microphone up. Okay, go ahead. I was supposed to do that. Could you speak a little louder so we can capture it?
Yeah. I'm really interested in like the data insights you guys had in the campaign, and like what you determined to be important and why.
Wow. So the question is what the data insights were in the campaign, what we determined to be important and why. That's a really, really broad question.
Yeah.
In general, in the campaign, we are obsessed with measuring everything. And that could be, I mean, you name it, if it's there, you measure it, because there's only one real metric that matters, which is election day, and there's no directly measurable way to understand your progress to it. So it's kind of like a moonshot, like the whole, like Eric Schmidt validating us, that was important because there was a time where people were convinced the stuff we were building was ridiculous and wouldn't hold up and wasn't all this stuff. Then it wasn't that they thought like we weren't good at what we did, they're just incredibly nervous and there's no way to see it. So you measure everything around it. You measure how many people you're registering, what states you're registering them in, how many doors you're knocking on, phone calls you're making, actual conversations that are being held, in-person conversations, house parties, media metrics, survey results. I mean, if it's there, you measure it and you try to figure out what the line is between that thing and your end goal of the campaign itself. So one metric I can give you is we registered more people in 5 of the battleground states than the margin of victory. So we knew going into election day, we felt pretty confident that we were on target because we knew that we had gotten our ground game out and that we were registering people.
Data is, we had reams and reams and, mountains of data. And
We had binders full.
too soon there. We had tons of data, and there was an entire analytics team that was devoted to making sense of the data. And the one thing that I took away from it all is you can measure and quantify and do all sorts of crazy stuff, but unless you have a clear, concise way to present your data and the stories that it's telling you, it's all for nothing. And for example, when we were about to take Dashboard public, Jason and I and some other people were demoing it to Jim Messina, the campaign manager, and we had all sorts of, things. Oh, we've got these many accounts. People are signing up at this rate, all this stuff, blah blah blah. And his gut feeling and the decision came down to basically 2 questions that he asked: does it make people's lives easier, and is it fast? Does it make people's lives easier is impossible to quantify. That is so squishy, and you could go any way with it.
So always answer yes.
So yes,
By
it makes
1/3.
people's lives easier. Is it fast? That we could quantify, and that we had tons of data. We had lots of performance data, and we could say this is where we're at, this is where we want to be at, this is our plan. We measure week by week. I think pursuing data itself is not the goal, but trying to figure out the story that it's going to tell you. That's my insight into data.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, coming from a private sector background in terms of competition, like how much were you guys concerned with or like having your eye on what Romney's campaign was building?
Sure. So the question is, how much were we looking at what Romney was doing? Not a whole lot. And I mean, not you can't actually do it that way, right? We had 18 months because we were reelecting a sitting president, and so Romney in the meantime was busy with a primary season, and so we looked at and we knew what everybody else was doing, but for the most part, the innovation was bringing us in-house. There were vendors who had done similar things before. And so we had people who'd had a laundry list that went back a decade of things that they wanted to see happen. And we also had opportunities for innovation, from ideas that we brought with us. And so we, from the get-go, were like, we're going to put our foot down and do this stuff and just, hit the gas as much as we can. They later, there were some times where they lifted things from us, sometimes word for word, designs or copy, and I think that's a tribute to a lot of the people who worked in the design teams. And it makes sense. If you're on their side of the fence, you've basically come out of a bloody primary, and now you turn around and you're facing a well-oiled machine that's been going for a year. You got to do it somehow, and maybe they bent a little bit, from where they should have been.
And the campaigns operated they had fundamental differences in how they operated. I don't think there's a lot that could translate from one to another.
Yeah.
Assuming this was your biggest challenge in your career so far, what's next? Is there something else that you see on the horizon that is the same juices flowing that you're passionate about, that you really want to sink your teeth into?
Pretty much being here right now. But go ahead.
I can speak. So I've actually started working as an independent consultant to a group in Chicago that does a lot of advocacy for open government and open data initiatives. I'm really interested in how we can take some of the lessons that we learned on the campaign in terms of engaging, regular people for collective action and getting them more involved in government.
Yep. Pretty much the same thing that Chris just said. Yeah. There you go.
I've talked to a lot of the engineers that were on our team that are having a really hard time now, honestly, because they keep getting pitched by these amazing startups that are doing these really cool things, but to them it just sounds so boring because it's like, that's cool. So are we electing someone? Like, how are we changing the world? Selling more things? That's cool. But
I was offered, IBM was like, hey, do you want to come back? And I thought about it and I was like, I can't go back to that kind of work. I need to think about something is in a much bigger scale, and I think there's a huge amount of opportunity out there.
One of the side observations I'd make, not as part of the campaign, is that there's really no offboarding from a campaign, and there's not even discussion about it. I mean, my sense is, because I talked to these guys, I started talking to them sort of the day after, once they had that white paper off of their faces, so you could actually talk to them. And there wasn't preparation, there wasn't discussion, there wasn't sort of let's sit down and talk about it. It was all sort of the analogy I'd give is the thermometer dropped and the mercury just went to all four corners. And but my sense is that of the team, there's a lot of thinking about how to apply for really big things going on.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if you saw it, there's a video on YouTube where the president came into the office the day after the election, and he sort of breaks up, and he basically gave us all a charge, right, which was to continue the work that he had begun a long time ago on the south side of Chicago. And he went around the office and hugged everybody and shook our hands and thanked us. And yeah, after that, it's hard to say, yeah, I will help you sell more widgets. And there's nothing wrong with selling widgets. Like, it's totally a good thing to do, and I've sold a lot of them myself. But at that point, you kind of realize that you're given a pretty unique opportunity. You've had a privileged experience, even though it was tough. And so you need to figure out a way to help, leverage that in a way that makes sense and is good.
It's also interesting to me because these guys were part of the campaign, and it was a first to really have a big engineering team as a part of the campaign. So historically, a lot of this kind of capability was outsourced, was in something that was already a consulting kind of an organization. So my sense of that was that the culture of that other thing was that it was an ongoing consulting organization, and so you did this for a while, then you did the next one or whatever. This is different, right? This is a startup within a startup, and then it wasn't anymore on one day. Other questions? Yeah.
I'm curious about this touch example. Were you able to square this
No, I mean, a lot of what he said was,
Repeat the question. The question was about
Sure.
Tufty, and was he able to reconcile the input, and has he gotten over it, and is he still stressed out and have weird dreams?
sure, yeah, no, we're good, I think. I don't know, maybe Tufty's still somewhere angry that he ever had to see that. It burned his eyes. Yeah, no, I mean, it was good. I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that we put up, actually, like these last slides, kind of show, like, so we started with a lot of stuff that we went to more like process flowy type stuff, and then by the end, we just did stuff like this. So, you know, if you do this, your problem is you as a designer go somewhere and like make a thing and then you show it to people. Where if you do this, you tape a bunch of screenshots to a whiteboard. Anybody can walk up to that whiteboard. They don't have to know a technology or do something with a tool. They can just do this thing, right? And that's, oh, did I kill this? So this is a lot of what we would do. And like I would draw stuff on an iPad and then I would use Bootstrap and I would make it and then people could interact with it. And so a lot of his stuff was right in terms of, you know, he would talk about, like I think the biggest thing we heard from him, which was really smart before he saw wireframes and things went south, was he would talk about like recipes, right? Like how interfaces are about making recipes and it's basically showing you how to put together the elements to do something. And so there was a lot of good stuff. And like he's a great guy. I mean, I'm kind of teasing, but he went from like really genteel and awesome to like cranky old man like really fast, which is hilarious and good. But yeah, so we definitely got more agile. We had to teach iteration to people. Like again, like Chris said, people never iterated on campaigns before, and so a lot of them, you know, like a lot of it was sort of, and this is something Eric helped us with too. Like he would come in and say, "Why don't you release it? Why don't you release it?" And the reason why is because on a presidential campaign, like the software internally might be crappy, and you might ask volunteers to do stuff on really substandard things, and you're like, "Oh, it's kind of bad. Don't worry about it." But in terms of optics, everything has to be perfect. Events are perfect. Rallies are perfect. Everything is perfect. And there's a bunch of work that goes into that behind the scenes to make sure that things go off in a seamless fashion. And so they wanted the software to be done in the same way. And we're like, actually, it should be messy and it should just get out there. And that's when you're really going to learn what it is. And that was definitely a cultural disconnect.
I mean,
Yeah.
as someone on the other end of all that, right, I'd argue that the campaigns actually in the field are really messy because you've got, you know, someone like is, you know, giving their car to be the local campaign headquarter for a period of time, right?
Totally.
And they like didn't clean it up before you actually have the meeting in the car. So at the event level, right, like when Obama comes to Civic Park and there are tens of thousands of folks, incredibly well orchestrated. But at the actual end user level, the field level, it actually is pretty messy.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. I mean, we did a survey of people who'd worked in the campaign previously. So one of the weird things about being a user experience person is that for the first 80% of the campaign, there's no users actually there. So there's nobody really to talk to. So you talk to people and you say, well, what was it like 4 years ago when you did this? And you have these really roundabout conversations. But everybody who was in a field office talked about the need for training and for some of the apps from some of the vendors that we'd worked with to be improved. And it was really, really basic stuff. But yeah, the stuff that is for the most committed people tends to be a little bit more ugly than the stuff that's kind of consumer focused.
Got a lot of questions here, all the way in the back. Yes. So I think the questions were, what was the best piece of advice that you were given during the campaign? And the other was, what advice would you give to someone other than don't do it? Dylan?
So the best piece of advice that I got wasn't actually advice. It was a coworker being incredibly snarky on my first day, which was prior to the campaign, I worked for myself, so I did whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. It was great. And then my first day, I had a meeting scheduled at 5:30 p.m., and I was like, what is this? I have to get home because my son goes to bed at 6:30. So, like, if I'm here until 6:30, I'm not going to be there. So, like, let's work on our scheduling. And this coworker turned to Harper, who was my boss, ignoring me completely as if I didn't exist, and was like, he knows he's not going to see his family, right? That was Teddy. And it was shocking and painful and all of those things, but it's true. Like, if you're doing the campaign, it is a commitment that is beyond a commitment that you would do for other things. Like, I actually didn't answer what was my worst moment. My worst moment was my son's 3-year-old birthday party, which I got home for 15 minutes before it started and left 15 minutes after it ended. That was in the middle of a 70-hour day. That was my low point. Like, the level of commitment to actually getting this done is so extreme because there's so much to do and there's so much at stake that you have to make incredibly hard choices every day, and choices that, frankly, if you're thinking rationally about it, you won't make the choice the way that you do. So that is sort of the realm of advice that I would give people.
Ouch. The best thing I heard was from a friend who'd worked in 08, and his line was, find good people doing good things and do good things with them. And it goes back to that whole field office notion of, you don't really know, like, I mean, here's the weird thing about campaigns, right? People keep showing up all the time and you don't actually know what they do and you don't know why they're there. And so, just taking that time to figure out sort of who you are and what you're doing together, even if it's just brief, it pays dividends, because you never know when suddenly, a year into this thing, something else is going to be happening and you're going to be in a room with them and you're going to have to, hopefully have their support in whatever you're doing. And it helped out a lot. One of the other things I told a lot of the folks in the campaign was slow is smooth, smooth is fast. So you see people running around with their hair on fire, and it's like, no. I know there's like 30 things you need to get done today, but in reality, you're going to get done like 4. So if you want to get them done well, slow down, do what you have to do, and like get it done, and then move on to the next thing. And if you do that, all of a sudden you get everything done a lot quicker, because you'd see people sort of, you just get lost in the moment. There's everybody yelling at everybody else, and you sort of like lose it, and you just can't do that. So you got to slow it down.
Would any of you work on a campaign again?
I would not.
Probably not. I mean, I came for some pretty specific reasons, and I came because I believe in the president, and I thought that this election was, there's a couple things going on in terms of money and sort of the broader political outlook that I felt like this was an election we had to win. But in addition, I felt it was a difference between his legacy being denigrated like President Carter's, or being really upheld and affirmed like President Lincoln. And I definitely wanted him to be in that latter category of great American leader. Thought we needed him.
How about you, Dylan?
Not full time. I would happily help in some way, but I highly encourage everybody to do it, honestly. I know that I talk about it like it was crazy and terrible in a lot of ways, and it was. But it's worth it, which is remarkable, because, like, if the downsides are so extreme, the upsides are that much more extreme that it makes it all worth it. I've talked to a good number of friends that work in Chicago, working in politics, trying to bring technology into Chicago politics and into the county, and there's a lack of really excited technologists spending time to make these things better. So I view the time that I spent on the campaign as sort of my tour, and I have friends in Chicago that are trying to bring on technologists to do the same thing, because the only way that I made it through was knowing that it was 18 months. Because, like, having that end date was all that got me through the last 17 and a half months. But, like, knowing that there's an end date means that, like, you can make the hard choices, and you can do that for a short period of time. And you can affect incredible change in 18 months. So whether it's campaigns or helping with technology or whatever it might be for the city, the county, the state, whatever it might be, I highly encourage anyone to get involved because it's worth it.
Yes.
You mentioned optimization. From a management perspective, the process, the UI, and technology, where did you find biggest impact from optimization?
So the question was what was optimizable and where were the biggest impacts on optimization, to paraphrase in a really unfair way.
Well, that's a biggie. I'll talk about UI optimization because we optimized everything. I mean, from these guys optimizing technology stack and performance and things like that to optimizing what we showed to people and things like that. The things that worked the best, and a lot of the people who worked on this directly, Dan Ryan in particular, who ran front end on the campaign. We had a really great team, and we had a lot of people, and you basically kept testing stuff over and over again because your assumptions were A, never accurate, and B, something that you took as wisdom for 5 or 6 weeks suddenly would stop working. So you always had to retest and just keep things going that way. But also just some of the stuff, that you kind of forget inside of the bubble is the stuff that does the best. And so like a lot of that was where people on my team helped out a lot, which was just, hey, remind people when you're on a contribution form, remind them what they're doing here. Like, why did they show up to that form, right? What can you tell them about this election that should motivate them, right? Like, letting people know those things. You can optimize a lot out of user interface to like figure out how to make interactions happen more quickly or more efficiently or more frictionlessly. But a lot of the things that really provided a lot of impact were things that connected people back to what the campaign was really about.
The one thing that I think had the greatest impact in terms of optimization was optimizing where we optimized. There are limitless things that we could spend our time trying to optimize, and getting the bulk of our engineers to say, okay, I'm going to leave this code in that I know is bad, but is only going to be used infrequently so that I can optimize this thing that actually gets used all the time. It's hard because it's really hard to be like I'm looking at this code and I can see where it's going to break terribly, but it's going to break terribly once in 18 months versus this thing that is a tenth of a second slower than we'd like it to be, but is used 1,000 times a minute. So that was the best optimization that I think we did on our side.
Very meta.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yep.
Could you talk a little bit about the hardware and software that you use? There's been reading an article about the open source software that's not been released by the Obama administration. And if you guys have any thoughts about that or looking at that?
So the question was, talk a little bit about the hardware and software that was used, and in particular, the software that was created and what's happened to that. And you guys, it was all mainframes, right? That's pretty much, you got signed on, you get a mainframe.
Yeah, we bought a couple of AS400s at the beginning.
You're
and,
off to the races. IBM?
Yeah.
More of a PvP guy myself, but
Almost in all of our physical stack was AWS. We had, I think, 8 servers that ran analytics stuff that were actual physical boxes, but we also had those mirrored in AWS. So like everything was virtual. So on the hardware stack, that's what that was. On the software side, the software that we built was it's great. It would be great if some parts of it could be open sourced, but that's really not in my wheelhouse, as they say. So I don't think that there were really any open source projects that we used and improved upon that we haven't pushed back to. I don't think that's really where any of this conversation comes from. But at this point, I believe all of the software is with Organizing for Action, and they are continuing to use it right now.
In terms of what we use to actually build the apps, we use we used a number of well-known frameworks. So PHP, we used Kohana. Ruby, we used Rails. Python, we used Flask and Django. There was some Java, some Hadoop. Basically, one of the great things that Dylan laid out early on with building the software that we built was that let the engineers use the tools that they feel the most comfortable with. And we had an amazing ops team that was able to pretty much host whatever we built. So they weren't tied to one particular language or this is how we're going to host everything. It was you engineers focus on building really awesome scalable apps. We'll focus on doing the work necessary to run it. And the diversity of the talent on the technology team is reflected in the diversity of the languages that we use to build the software.
I think with respect to the question of what went into organizing for action versus and what's going to happen to all that, again, one of my observations is that the half-life of a lot of these things may not be that long.
Yeah. An amazing amount of what we did was very purpose-built for a huge presidential election. So just taking all the software we built and putting it out in the wild probably doesn't make sense. If anything, I hope that people look at what we did as kind of a validation of proof of concept, that embedding a technology team within a political organization and letting them build software, letting them do things that are classic patterns from enterprise, which is you take huge siloed data stores and all these disparate processes, put them together, wrap them with a nice API, and build a platform on top of that, and then build really kick-ass apps that use it and scale to build that. I mean, that's novel. We didn't build anything really awesome or novel on the campaign. We didn't make a new sorting algorithm. We didn't build a new framework or anything like that. We practiced solid fundamentals, used tools that were well accepted and well supported, and built apps on top of that. And I think for even 2 years in midterms, 4 years in the next next presidential election, people look back and say, okay, they did it and it worked out, so we should probably do it as well. I hope that's our legacy more than any single line of code that any of us wrote.
Let me pivot a little bit toward, that's probably not the right word, but let's talk.
Pivot is a loaded term.
Pivot, I forget pivot. I didn't say pivot, nor did I say, sort of old code base you're going to go back to. But citizen engagement, right? It's a big topic. You guys each mentioned it, that this whole notion of sort of bringing technology passion to getting more open government, more involved citizenry, right? Again, one of my observations is that a real success of the campaign was that it ended up lighting a fire on the part of folks to actually get off their, out of their chair and go talk to and interact with someone else. And you kind of get all that in the context of a campaign. But the question is, how do you do that when it's about, like a cool API parking app for Boulder, right? In other words, what are the things that have to happen to make this stuff apply, right?
I think if one of the key concepts that factored in the development of Dashboard was this concept of a ladder of engagement. So you start off very low at the bottom, so it's somebody says they're interested in supporting or interested in getting involved, so they're at the bottom rung of the ladder. And every action that an organizer or somebody in the campaign is trying to do is to bring that person up the ladder of engagement. A lot of that is giving them tools to get more involved. So take that first action of signing up to attend an event, or make that $5 donation by clicking on an email or something like that. Because once you get somebody moving up that ladder, it's very easy to continue that momentum, to keep them going up higher and higher. So go to another event. Okay, bring a friend to an event. Host an event at your home. Join a team, all that. That ladder of engagement, I think, can be repurposed in a number of applications, especially in terms of civic engagement. So your concept of a parking app in Boulder, well, maybe you get one person using that. What does it mean for that person to be using it? Well, there needs to be some sort of way for them to find this. So now there's an ecosystem of apps in Boulder. You get them using it, they get their friends using it, maybe they start looking to see what other apps are there in Boulder. And then, it kind of, people get more and more involved and say, hey, maybe I could do this. Maybe I have an idea for an app, let me work with the developer. It's not easy getting up those levels. Those are huge. But if you can put more rungs in that ladder, just to get people, thinking about how to get engaged, how to use all these apps, I think that'll set you down the path to success.
And just a quick follow-on to that. I think one of the gaps, I mean, I just was talking to Code for America about this. I think there's this gap between people who, like, there's data in cities, and now there's engineers who are interested in working to free that. And then there's sort of the bigger gap of how do you actually get that to be relevant to people within the community. And I think a lot of times those aren't necessarily design solutions, or I mean technology solutions. It's more design stuff in terms of, you know, one of the apps we were talking with Code for America about in San Francisco, they actually got a lot of uptick by simply putting signage in place, right? So people actually could, you know, you hit them where they live. Oh, they happen to be going to a specific place. Hey, did you know you can also do this online? Right, and I think having that type of stuff, it's really simple, but this is the kind of stuff, like one of the slides in here has, you know, did you do your dashboard? Like, we knew we were winning in field offices more than a metric when people started putting those signs up because they were asking people to communicate and participate in that way. So when you start seeing that stuff show up around your stuff, or you kind of boot it yourself that way, it helps people think that it's actually something that could happen.
Great. Yeah.
I really love the fact that you guys have talked about how open source is a mechanism for getting access to code for more people. But I'm interested in your thoughts about the prospect that it's still an abstraction layer or a layer that's not all that accessible to the common man, because the common man doesn't know how to code. There's no point in giving him a code library because he doesn't necessarily know what to do with it. So it's the next level of providing him with the capability to access code without being coded.
Yes, there was.
I'm not repeating that question.
So the basic question is, if you don't code, how does things being open source work for you or help? Actually, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and a whole bunch of other sort of leading lights in technology just released a thing called code.org, because their belief is that if you're 8 and up, you should be learning how to do that today. But I do think there's a lot of different ways for people to get involved, and I think one of those ways is just, you know, wrangle an engineer out of somewhere and then help kind of communicate what the needs are to those people. Because, I mean, engineers love solving problems. It's what makes them engineers in the first place. And there's a lot of problems out there, and a lot of times the solutions aren't solely technical, right? I mean, you know, a lot of the stuff that we saw work in the campaign, like, I mean, you know, it worked because of the amazing talents of the guys sitting up here on stage with me and the people on the team, you know, men and women both. But in reality, it worked because we made it easy for volunteers to use stuff and get engaged with it and actually shape it with their feedback. And I think there's always a way to get that loop to go, and it's more about community and less about, you know, bits.
Yeah, and to the point about whether open sourcing anything really would help or not, the big value of what we did was not in code; it was in changing the way that people think about how they do that. Which you don't need to know how to write code to do that. And there are far more roles for people to play in figuring out how to leverage technology to help solve problems than just actually writing the code. Writing the code is one part of it, and there are shortcuts that are there to do that, but getting people to think about how using technology to make civic engagement better, to make campaigns better, those things don't require knowledge of coding. So getting people to think that way is really the big thing.
Yeah.
Sometimes a lot of the system will change how you organize things. Did the outcome of the first debate change how you organize this process?
So is that like the 5th worst
Yeah.
day of the...
No, I mean, not really. So the question was, like, did the first debate kind of change where we were going? No, which was great. We had great leadership in that way. They told us very clearly from the outset that we'd have good days and bad days, and our strategy was based on our values, which was to expand the electorate and to get people involved in their communities and to use technology to help them do that. And that's what we were going to do. So we had a bad day, and everybody does at some point, and you say, okay, that was a bad day. Let's keep on keeping on.
Yeah, and the technology group in particular did not do very much reacting to what's going on in the world. We had our course, and it was fairly well plotted from 18 months back, and we were going to continue on that path. The rest of the campaign, there are certain groups that did need to be very reactive, and they would sort of wind around their path, but the campaign in general kept going in the same path. So,
let me pick on somebody whom we haven't picked on yet. Go ahead.
I was wondering if you could talk about the security of your campaign. Did you have any type of cyber attacks or things like that? How did you collect that or anything like that?
The question was about security and cyber attacks. Did China steal all the code? Are we going to see this in the next Chinese election?
So security is obviously a very important aspect of how we architect and build all the applications. So important that there was an entire engineer dedicated to strictly just doing security analysis. His name is Ben Hagen. He was absolutely incredible to work with. He specialized in bringing security via public shaming, which is an amazingly effective tactic. He would spend his days basically inspecting what we were building, and if he found a vulnerability, he would exploit it. And we had a group chat room, and he would send a link, and when he had exploited one of these pages, you would usually see an animated GIF of a dancing otter with the song "This Is It" by Kenny Loggins playing in the background. Now, if you got the audio or the image to work, that is just the scope and the depth of what he was able to exploit. But by putting it out there in front of everybody, you get embarrassed and you're like, oh man, what do you find now? But then you would fix it. But treating security as a first-class concern and having kind of this continuous process where he was looking at things and making sure he was on top of it was very helpful. I met with him almost every week, and he would always start off the meeting saying, "What are you concerned about?" And just him asking that made me spend so much time reflecting on how we were building things, what we were concerned about, and that would usually lead to a discussion of, okay, if you're concerned about that, you should probably do this. And by the way, I was looking at your code, and you should probably consider doing this or like this, or hey, there was another Rails vulnerability. Are we using this? Should we be concerned? Having him on our team, having him always there, was really awesome. He had a crack team of volunteers that would come in on the weekends and do a lot of physical security assessments, so things like the office network, doing penetration testing on systems in the office, stuff like that. Yeah, security was always at the front of our minds.
Did you get hacked?
No. So Ben did all of the application security and all the penetration testing on that, and that was actually a checkbox that had to get checked before anything got pushed to production, that he reviewed what it was in staging with enough time, which is why we had our release process ended up baking in about 2 days for legal sign-off, which is something that still blows my mind. Like, got to get legal sign-off for all of our changes. Cool. And security testing. In addition to Ben, there were also people that were doing more physical security and doing security of the network and all of the non-application security stuff. So it was, it's a very real concern. And again, luck helped a lot.
Yeah. At one point when all the interns came in, we actually had to have little classes that everybody had to go to show you not to click on the funny attachment that came from somebody that doesn't sound like someone you know.
Yeah.
Because they did.
Ben would run phishing attacks on our local network, and it was always fun seeing who actually clicked on the links, because there were blatant phishing attempts, but some people would still look at it.
Seasoned engineers that would be like, oh, what's this? Click.
I'm still waiting for that money from Nigeria.
Yeah, right.
Other questions? Yes.
Based on your experience, were there any problems that still weren't solved that you hope to see solved as we have next?
Question was, were there any problems that you intended to solve or that you hope to solve that weren't solved that you'd like to see solved for the next campaign? She said see solved.
Yeah, sure.
This is something we didn't get a chance to explore it too much, and I wish we had, because I think it's really fascinating, is the concept that everybody here has their own personal social network. Like, we have people that we know. How, instead of trying to construct our own network for organizing to support the campaign or whatever cause, how can we essentially bring our own networks to bear and basically use tools that link these existing networks and kind of fill in the gap between them? We didn't get a chance to do that. We ended up building a lot. We ended up rebuilding a lot of things that already exist, but making them applicable for the campaign. If we can take some of the lessons we learned doing that and make that work on a broad scale, campaigns or not, I think that'd be a very, very interesting problem to tackle.
I think everything, right? Like literally, we came in, so we were sort of the first bunch to do this, right? I was the first, user experience and product person. Dylan was the first director of engineering. So you don't show up that way, and like in industry, it's very popular now to say, oh, we show up and we disrupt things and we change things up. That was not our job. Like, disruption is not what a presidential reelection campaign is about. It's about like conservatism and like moving things forward and like just doing it, right? And so there's a lot of things, and just down to the fact that we did a really good job. We did a better job than anybody had done, uniting online and offline organizing. And we didn't, there's still a lot of paper in field offices. There's still a lot of disconnect between what's happening in social media and what's happening on the ground. So, yeah, I think, Dylan referenced it earlier too. What we did was cultural, and hopefully, future campaigns will continue to build this type of stuff. Hopefully that stuff will build in a way that builds on itself. And, we see new ways for participation to happen. I think that's the story of the 21st century, is data and participation.
Yeah, I think just more. Like, there aren't any specific problems that I can point to, but I want more things to happen, because frankly, if next cycle someone puts together technology that's exactly like what we had, it will be an incredible failure.
Listen.
Just a question. Were there any problems in your campaign that weren't solved, that you hope to see solved by tech by next election?
Yeah, data entry. Right, so there's a lot of tools out there for data entry, and data entry takes a lot of time for people in the field, and it's tedious work, and it's really hard. And there's ways you can optimize it, and we got a lot of those things released, but again, culturally, we didn't quite get there.
Isn't that one of the things that Orca was trying to do?
Yeah, Romney's campaign had a tool called Orca that it just blew up. So, yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
The question was, I'll just repeat the question. The question was whether they feel like they made innovations that really cross that chasm between online activity and offline activity. Were there innovations that really helped address that issue?
Okay, so as a former professor, I'll put on my professor hat. So all technology is a form of mediating between two humans, and it's hard for that to be as effective as just going face to face. Right? Like, it's much higher fidelity for the two of us to be sitting here than it is for us to tweet at each other. And so, there's a lot of collectivism, and, hopefully some of the things we did was stuff like Dashboard, which actually, when you signed up, you got connected to your neighborhood team, and your neighborhood team leaders were told, hey, there's somebody new in your area to get involved. And the next step that they would take would be to message you and say, hey, I'm right down the street. Do you want to grab coffee? Like, trying to make that transition point of you behind a screen to you actually engaged and sharing in person. And hopefully that type of stuff we can see happen more and more.
Yeah, I think I'm going to make up the statistics because I don't remember it, but I think it was offline users that were also Dashboard users were, I think it was 45% more effective. Like, they just contacted that many more people. They got that much more change happening. So I do think that we absolutely built things that made it better. I also think that there is all of the change left to happen. So like we scratched the surface and it was great. I think that we proved out the model, as it were, but there's endless stuff left to do.
I think the call tool was fairly useful in that regard. I mean, you know, it wasn't getting you off your seat, but it was getting you in verbal contact quickly and easily in a way that was easy to keep the record going, et cetera. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, call tool was something where you could go to a web page and put in your information, and you could then be shown a script and a person's phone number and their name and everything, and then you could go ahead and call them, and you could talk to them about whatever particular set of issues were in that script, and you could record their response. And it was really super successful, especially at the end of the campaign for GOTV. We ran out of people to call because we had so many people calling online, which was awesome. And yeah, it was really good. And I've had a lot of people tell me stories as we've kind of gone around and talked about our experience. I had a woman who was, a paraplegic come in and tell me, this allowed me to get involved, and I couldn't have done it without it. We had a 91-year-old, excuse me, a World War II vet in North Carolina who just rocked it, right? And the same kind of thing. He wasn't that ambulatory, and for him it was his way of participating. So, and that's one of the things that we try to do with this campaign. It was about uniting the two things, but it was also that there was a lot of skepticism in the part of volunteers that people online could actually do things that mattered. And so giving people tools that actually did matter and showed that they could have impact was a big win.
Other questions? Yes.
I think after the first election, a lot of people thought, wow, this great organizing machine, and then it didn't translate into people who are supporting the president's policies. So that's just kind of something that I'm still trying to understand. You guys built all this stuff. Even if the future is going to take it this much farther, is there a reason that the campaign tools can't now be used by the president to maybe do a better job? I've heard of that president's office talking about that, how the next step is they're going to use tools like this to mobilize the electorate to demonstrate what they want to see happen in Congress and the Senate. So can you speak to how the president's going to do that and whether he's going to have the ability to use any of the kinds of things that you build to support that? I'm just curious.
So since I'm like not part of the campaign here, the question was, why the hell hasn't Organizing for Action picked all this shit up and used it? Just to paraphrase the question. Now we got that permanently recorded.
The super quick answer is they are. So there's an organization that was recently created called Organizing for Action, which is staffed. They're staffing up now, and it's staffed by a bunch of the people that were on the campaign, and they now control all of the technology that we built, and they are working to do exactly that.
And are they organizing for not-for-profit? I'm just curious.
I believe they're a social benefit.
Yeah, they had to change their legal status, so the type of nonprofit entity that does a political campaign is different than the type of political entity that does what in effect qualifies as lobbying. It's technically a lobbying organization because you're asking people to take action, whether it's just calling your senator technically in a way is lobbying, right? So that's they reorged that way and transferred everything over. Sure.
Again, from the outset, my experience is campaigns are really funky things because they have an end date, and there is no transition from that end date. It's not contemplated, it's not trained for, it's not provided for in any fashion. And so when it's done, it's done. And I do know in this context there is a successor organization that's been set up, but my perspective is that even though it's staffed by a lot of the folks who were associated with the other, it's still a successor organization. It's entirely new. It inherited probably debt rather than any kind of resources. So it's got to go out and it's got to resource, it's got to staff, it's got to come up with this mission. It's a different form of organization. It's not a campaign, it's a C4, I think, technically. So, right, yeah, so.
So the question is, if we're doing agile development, how do we get the feedback loop with user input? So We would do things like use Ethnio, which is a way to solicit basically user feedback. Jason can probably talk about how we use that. We also ruthlessly and aggressively measured usage of features. So even without users saying what they were doing, we could measure what they were using and then usage over time. So if we saw a feature going down or up, if we released something and we saw that suddenly, because we changed its position on a page, it was more visible, we realized something was working. If suddenly it dropped because we made a change and hid something, we realized, we could see that pretty quickly. We also had enough volume in some of our apps that we could see these changes very, very quickly. We also had a crack support team that responded to thousands and thousands of pieces of feedback from the user. Every page had a feedback link at the bottom that would pop up a form where you could bang in your name, your location, and your feedback, and that would go to Zendesk, and that would be bubbled up. And that was a mix of technical issues like help me reset my password, to this page sucks, make it better, to wouldn't it be awesome if you guys made a commercial that said this, I'm willing to produce it for you, call me. Our support team would wade through all of that. They would find the interesting pieces, and then that would bring that up to our product management team, and we could review it and see which ones were technically feasible. You want to talk about Ethnio and how you use that?
Sure. So one of the ways that we didn't fail on election day in particular was, and I don't mean to cast a lot of aspersions at our competitor, but we used Ethnio on pretty much on the public website, on dashboard, on pretty much anything we could get it on. And it's a live interrupt tool. So what it does is it interrupts your experience and says, hey, can you give us your name and your phone number and some other information? And I recruited a nationwide network of usability volunteers, basically people who had been trained in usability testing. And so what we'd do is we would just have them turn it on when they had said they would take some time to do this. And they would do it, and they would just walk through the site with the person in real time and ask them, like, hey, what are you trying to get done? Is it working for you? We'd get that feedback. We'd get feedback from Zendesk, as Chris said, and we would just take that, and I would just make the product managers put time in their roadmap to address what we heard. So we had a lot of different ways for people to get feedback. With all the get out the vote stuff, one of the things, while Dylan was running game day and making everybody's lives hell, I went to Wisconsin because it was far away. But we also just took all those usability people and we asked them to actually go into individual field offices, and we had a prototype set up, and we would just walk them through the prototype and say, will this work for you? And so we did that. We did nationwide conference calls. The conference calls are a little janky, but at least you get some feedback, you get some general feeling, and people, if nothing else, they feel heard, which is great. And so then we used all that to make sure that the product we built for making sure the election was going the way we thought it was in terms of getting out the vote actually did work. And the Romney campaign actually emailed 80-page PDFs to senior citizens, and then they couldn't print them out, and then they suppressed their own vote, which thank you, so that's what you do.
But in terms of getting the feedback, essentially it was any method that we could get, and then it would bubble up through the organization to the PM for that product. Or in the case of the API, it would be from the engineer sitting right next to them yelling at the API engineers. So,
Yelling is good.
Very small feedback loop there.
We can probably take another couple of questions, and I think we're going to break and do refreshments and all that if anyone's got them. I've got one. One thing that you guys observed was how close you were between engineering, sort of writing the code, and ops. Because it was all out of the cloud. Can you talk a little bit about how you got to the decision that they needed to be that close? I think you said they started out as IT.
Yeah. So originally our DevOps group was not in our team at all. It was the organizational structure was there was a CIIO, which is a made up thing, but reporting to him was the CTO, an analytics officer, and the CIO, and the tech group was all of us and 60 other people. They're sitting back here. You just can't see them.
Spirit.
And the DevOps team, which was sitting with us doing the same things that we were doing, actually reported through a different organizational structure. That didn't make any sense. It sounded right on paper because it was like, these people are playing with servers, so they should play with servers with the server people. But in reality, they were using servers to be able to best leverage the applications that they were helping to bring to the public. So after far too long, we realized that and brought them in as just another part of the technology team. And that, frankly, helped quite a bit to be able to organize them the same way so that, we had a morning stand, we had, the product planning, as it were, which sounds kind of crazy for operations to have product planning, but it was like, these are the things that need to get out. These are the things that, this is the roadmap for how all of these things are going to be deployed. Let's work on that as a part of the overall technology organization.
Yeah. I mean, as an engineer, it was amazing to be able to literally walk 10 yards and hit an ops engineer on the back of the head and say, what's going on? Like, why is this slow? What's wrong with this? And then likewise, they could come over and say, you just deployed some code and it's thrashing the server, it's destroying everything, you need to fix it. Having that kind of tight feedback loop, much like having a tight feedback loop with our end users, being able to go back and forth between ops and engineering and actually have these teams work so closely together to build the apps in unison. They were building their platform to host everything while we were building the apps. So they're building it and they're scaling everything they've built while we're building and scaling our applications on top of it. They were able to tell us, if you code your things this way, you'll be able to take advantage of this piece of architecture, this bit of the cloud that will help you, and vice versa. We could go to them and say, hey, we need to build this feature for our users, but we're concerned about how it's going to scale, or we need to do this. What do you know about how Amazon structures things? Using that, how can we build this so it scales really well? That was, I think, absolutely key to our success for building technology. If it was a traditional enterprise where you have an engineering team and an operations team where you basically build it and then hand it over and say, run this, and then you've thrown it over the wall, that totally would not have worked in our organization. And I think it's a credit to our leadership that they were able to get the teams working so well together. It really worked.
So I've got one other question. Mobile. How much was that a factor when you guys started planning? In other words, were you saying, well, okay, we got to do, iPad, we got to think from a mobile device first? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, about almost 25% of our traffic came from mobile. So we designed everything to work on an iPad first. Basically, we knew tablets were a good middle ground for us. I mean, from the field point of view, you are always on the go. So doing something from a mobile device was great. But we also saw a lot more use of mobile even early on with things like the store, where people were buying things almost all the time, more so early on mobile devices than elsewhere. And I mean, that's part of why we did the quick donate application, where if you put in your credit card information, you could just text. Because mobile hits you where you live, and people don't live in front of laptops all the time anymore. I mean, we do, but we're outliers, and so you want to make sure you're actually where people are.
Yeah, we've used a number of responsive design techniques to build one application that would work across a variety of different screen sizes, essentially. So we could have one app that would gracefully scale down to an iPhone or up to a very large monitor. Using responsive design, we were able to, deliver one app that worked pretty well for all of our users. I know our front-end team had an amazing amount of talent in turning responsive designs that the designers would come up with into actual working code. They were continually amazing at what they were able to do. And yeah.
Did you guys avoid apps for the most part?
There was an official Obama 2012 app that came out in the summertime.
Yeah. yeah, we built a lot of apps early. Especially we built some apps to work with Square, and it felt a little silly, and it ended up working eventually. And like the app was actually, that's one of those examples of where we didn't get off paper. If you downloaded that app and you were a field organizer, you could go door to door with your iPhone or Android device, and you could basically canvas and do your data entry at the same time. But if you've ever actually canvassed a shift, you know that the piece of paper is actually a little bit easier. So it was a lot easier just to basically make websites for people. And it also hit our demographic in a good way, because again, if you have that kind of U shape, then the same thing that you're producing for people who, for the most part, are probably hitting the internet through a mobile device, or maybe a tablet, maybe a laptop. It's also the same interface that's going to work well for somebody who's using a desktop, at home or in a field office.
Yeah. The cool thing about the mobile app is that it used the same backend API that all of our other applications use. So even though it was a separate standalone app, the experience was pretty seamless. If you RSVP'd for an event via the mobile app, it would show up in dashboard and vice versa.
Yeah. Also, having that API made it so that we were able to develop that, frankly, incredibly full-featured mobile app in, I think it was 9 weeks from start to out, which is crazy.
Any other questions? Yes.
I find that a little amusing that your age jumps this curve. I spent my life primarily at the local level, community organizing. They have references to that as well as civic engagement. And that's what's caught my eye here. And I'm wondering about the scaling down what you're doing. And while it might be focused at a community level, if you think of all the communities we have, the potential is so enormous. It's hard to fathom. And I just wonder if that interests you, or if you know anybody working in that arena. Because bringing the technology to this is such an answer, especially with all the boomers retiring and a whole new group of people who potentially have more time. I just love to hear what you have to say about that.
Sure. Yeah, so the question was sort of civic engagement being sort of downsized from a presidential campaign to more the local level, and to take advantage of a lot of people's time, because there's a lot of really talented people who are retiring and have time on their hands, and they want to do something that is purpose-driven. Yeah, I think there are a lot of really good, there's a lot of startups out there that are doing things currently. There's one called, I think, like Neighborland, which is one that just is simply about trying to volunteer suggestions for what could change your neighborhood. It's a lot less civic engagement, but it's just an example. There's a ton of stuff that's happening, and I think more and more people are moving into this space. I think, when we started on the campaign, one of the things that struck me was that it felt a lot like, I worked at Orbitz before, and it felt a lot like disrupting green screen travel and travel agents. It felt a lot like what happened with online banking, right, where suddenly like you're going to have these totally different experiences. This stuff is coming. I mean, it's coming because I have been really fortunate lately to travel the country, and was traveling the country for the campaign doing research, and you keep hearing the same types of themes over and over again. So there's people who are interested and engaged and wanting it to happen. So I don't know that anybody has actually hit the right model yet or solved it, but there's a lot of people trying, and I think that's really encouraging.
There's a lot going on in Colorado as well. We'll be talking more about it tomorrow morning in the panel we're going to be part of, where the Secretary of State is going to be involved, the CIO of the state, the CTO of the state, and a bunch of folks at municipal levels and county levels as well, who are pushing open data, open government kind of initiatives. There's going to be a thing called Hack for Colorado, for example, over a couple of days at the end of May, where we're going to get a bunch of the best hackers around to hit on APIs and government data and try to make applications out of those things that have some use. But I think a lot of it's kind of at that stage. People are trying to figure out what stuff out of the data that's available is interesting, and how can you get some activism around all that. It's tough with local, in my experience, local and state governments. I mean, if it's siloed at the back end for you guys in terms of accessing data, it's way more siloed between sort of health and human services and veterans affairs and all the rest of the sources of back end data at the state and other level. In some cases, for really good reason. but there's a tremendous amount of really positive energy. I mean, I think the number of folks, the percentage of folks who think that's a really good thing to do and want to try to help is phenomenal. And there is a lot of really positive stuff here in Colorado. Yes, one more question, then I think we're going to wrap it up.
What you guys did was priceless.
Thank you. It was our privilege.
Best question ever. All right, thanks very much. I wanted to thank the Atlas Institute again, Silicon Flatirons, all of you for coming here today, these gentlemen for wending their way from Chicago. Alyssa, thank you very much, and Jill Dupree as well. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you out where the drinks are, the non-alcoholic drinks. Thank you.